Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Excellent. Well, we're delighted to be here today to talk about the midterms and all things political and the sort of fascinating nexus that we're now seeing between the corporate world and public policy and how the two play together or sometimes don't play together so well. We have a great panel here and we're going to have a great discussion today. So on my left is Fred P. Hochberg, the principal at Heyday, former chair of the Ex-Im Bank, former acting administrator of the Small Business Administration, as well, Ex-Im Bank under the Obama administration, and SBA under the Clinton administration. Next, we have María Teresa Kumar, founding president of Voto Latino, an advocacy group that works to register Latino voters and on public policy. Next, oh, okay. You brought your hype. Next, we have Susan Molinari, the former VP Public Policy at Google, a former member of the House of Representatives, a former keynote speaker at a Republican National Convention.
Not for Trump.
From 1996,
Bob
Dole.
Dole. I just want everybody to look at Bob Dole.
But
then I spoke for Joe Biden at the Democratic Convention, but not keynote.
Yeah.
I just had to get that out there. I don't want to start with the audience.
Yeah. And finally, we have Jen Stark, the co-director of BSR's, another hype person, all right. The co-director of BSR's Center for Business and Social Justice, which works with CEOs to get aware of and to think about public policy advocacy initiatives. So this is a great panel. Please give them a round of applause. So I'm mindful that we're talking in September. If we'd been talking about the midterms in May, we probably would have been talking about gas prices and inflation, which was sort of the narrative then. By June, the narrative shifted, and we were talking about Dobbs and sort of the awakening among, in particular, women voters through special elections and primaries. Then in August, it seemed like the narrative maybe shifted again. There was the Mar-a-Lago raid, and sort of former President Trump was back in the headlines. Not that he ever really left, but he was front and center in the conversation, and analysts wondered what that would mean. And then, more lately, like in the last week, inflation's been back up a little bit. There's certainly been talk about immigration. It seems like Republicans like Ron DeSantis are trying to shift the conversation back to immigration through the Martha's Vineyard stunt. And so where are we now? I'm sort of curious for the panelists. Maybe Jen, let's start with you. Dobbs is something I know you've been thinking about, but what are you seeing on the ground?
Sure. So what I'd say is it's even not so much Dobbs and Roe v. Wade falling. It's the fact that there are now 16 states where access to abortion is banned, and it's really that tangible impact of the impact of a Supreme Court case no longer upholding this constitutional right. 1 in 3 American women lack access to abortion internationally, and this is reverberating in multiple ways. A recent poll from Perriundum, 80% of all voters see the fall of Roe as a quote-unquote big deal, and nearly 80% have an understanding that even if abortion is illegal, it doesn't mean folks won't seek that kind of care. And I think what's more is it really sends a signal, a chilling signal about the states that ban abortion. We're seeing the repercussions. A third of parents are crossing states off the list where they will send students. And I think that has multiple economic impacts in the states that just has not been minded to this point.
You mean for universities?
For universities and higher education, exactly. Yeah. And more than 50% of young people, including young people of color, are increasingly, for those that are mobile, as far as talent mobility, are crossing states off the list where they will apply for jobs. So I think the impact of Dobbs and Roe falling is really vast and now is becoming more tangible at a community level.
Did BSR start hearing from more CEOs and maybe even new CEOs, when this started to happen?
Absolutely. In the wake of the leak and in preparation for the actual Supreme Court decision and in the days after, it was, I kind of always use the analogy, it was kind of the hurricane off the coast that everyone knew was coming, and they were bracing for impact. And our guidance was always to mind the workforce impact in terms of the policies and practices that you can enact. Companies are now very well versed at sort of toggling their benefits to meet the needs based on extreme social policy passed in the states. The 3.0 of these policies and practices is to mind the benefits ineligible segments of their workforce. And now increasingly we see the shift to companies considering ways they can engage in advocacy behind the scenes and more visibly.
You talked about Dobbs reverberating. I think our sound is reverberating a little bit too, and bear with us while we get that going. But Maria Teresa, I'm curious about the Latino vote. The New York Times had a report looking at the Latino vote and likely voters, what motivates Latino voters. This week, I think they changed the headline like 3 times from Democrats are falling short to Republicans haven't made enough ground to sort of it's a draw. What's your take, and what are you seeing in federal races in places like Texas and Florida where the Latino vote is so important?
Yeah, I would say that the Latino vote has been consistent, and it's the coverage and lack of understanding of the community that keeps shifting. I will tell you that I've never been in so many rooms where people try to Hispanic explain. Can you hear me now? Nope.
Uh-oh.
Nope. How about now? Hello? No, it's
There you
on.
go.
It's not. Here. I apologize if I swallow it. No, so I think one of the biggest challenges that we find in the Latino community is that there's really a grave misunderstanding of it in the mainstream. I'm going to give you 2 little facts. How about now? Can you hear me now? Okay, whoa, okay. I haven't started. So the mode of the white community is 58 years old. That's where if you were to look at a graph of where does the community bubble. In the African American community, it's 43. Who can guess what the mode is in the Latino community?
Got to be lower. No, must
31.
no. Ooh. That,
11.
wow. Wow.
Pre-voting.
And they are the ones that are coming of age in the states where all of a sudden all these anti-choice, anti-voting, all of these are coming of age in the exact same place. When you asked me of Georgia, Latinos represent 4% of the electoral base. People often say Latinos are not monolithic. They're absolutely right. But they're not monolithic, not on where they necessarily came from, with the exception of Florida, we could park them there, but generation. While they're 4% of the electoral base, 18 to 29-year-olds in Georgia are roughly 30% of a voting age Latinos. They're 20% of the classrooms in Georgia. They're 23% of the eligibility in Texas. They're 52% of the classrooms. So when you look at 52% of the classrooms, like, that's, oh my gosh, that's a lot. What did they do in 2020? They increased their voting participation by 23% in Texas alone. And you know what Abbott did? Instead of actually congratulating young people and young Latinos to finally start owning their space, they passed legislation that Voto Latino is now suing, because if you're on a college campus in Texas, you're not eligible to vote properly. They're creating barriers to make sure that young people cannot participate. And I don't care what part of the political spectrum you're on, that's undemocratic and that's un-American.
Is that the only state?
No.
Really?
So when you look, so the modern,
Sorry.
No, go.
no, I will share with you, the modern Jim Crow laws that came out of Shelby County under SCOTUS in 2013, it was Shelby County against Eric Holder. Eric hates it when I use his name, but that was the case he had to play. The most underreported story of Shelby County was that in the 2010 census, so 3 years prior, it had noted a 297% increase in the Latino community, a 93% increase in the African American community. And if you look at all the 22 jurisdictions that followed, they had at least a 90% increase in the Latino community.
Wow.
And so they were preparing for the future. 2010, the census showed that Latinos were 52% of the American population was Latino. It happened again in 2018. But the difference between, 2020, the difference between 2010 and 2020 was that in 2010, those growths were children under the age of 18. In Latinos, while they became technically the second largest community in America, we didn't become the second largest voting population in 2018. So all of the forces that are coming together is really talking about a multicultural America that did their job in 2018 and in 2020. We came together and we defined the country that we wanted. And our challenge now is to remind people, a lot of people hang their head, and I said, America won, and we have the receipts to prove it. when we look at legislation that is actually impacting everyday Americans, our job is to rinse, repeat, and do exactly that in the midterms. Because it's going to be close, because they keep moving the goalpost, but I keep reminding, just in the last 3 years, since the last midterm, the last 2 years, excuse me, we're expecting 6 million more young people to come of age. 2/3 of them who are kids of color. The potential's in front of us.
And what's the like level of voting in that group?
I mean, the biggest challenge that we have is not that there's an appetite. People ask me, so Voto Latino, we registered 650,000 people in 8 states the last cycle. 83% of them went out and voted. That was huge. The margin of victory in a blue state that is now considered a swing state, Arizona, we registered and turned out 32,000 folks. 19,000 were first-time voters. Biden won that state by 12,000. It's because we have 1 million young people turning 18 every single month, just in the Latino community alone. So it's not a lack of appetite, it's lack of will from investors in the community, and it has to be consistent. We don't just stop talking to Latinos right after the election. We keep talking to them. We reach roughly 11 million people a month. We explain to them that their vote works. We show them that one of the biggest issues was student debt. We worked with the administration and a whole consortium. All of a sudden, Latinos, they get a $20,000 relief on average because so many of them are eligible for Pell Grants, like I was. That's a game changer, not just for that person, but for that community.
Family, too.
For family, a lot of folks are like, well, young people don't want to buy homes. No, they can't because they're strapped by student loan. But this all of a sudden opens up the real equity of building wealth in communities, of marginalized communities, by saying, okay, I have some debt relief, but now I can actually qualify for that first home. Because you know what, millennials, they're in their 40s now.
Yeah.
And strapped. I mean.
So Susan, there was a lot said about the coalition of the ascendant during the Obama years. Certainly women voters and Latinx voters and other voters were seen to be part of that. There was a moment when they were sort of the Republican autopsy, thinking about, how do we reach out to these voters? And it seems like the Republican Party has not, in fact, has not taken.
Why would you say that?
Well, it's just it's like I read the paper, But so the Republican Party is taking a populist turn, and that's like interesting on a lot of levels. One is that it does seem to put the Republican Party at odds with corporate America and with the business community, which for decades was what the Republican Party stood for. So I'm curious, what do you make of that? And is there there have been moments along the way where you think the business community is turning a blind eye to populist policies. It seems like that is less and less possible. If you guys saw Dan Schulman, who was on the stage earlier this morning, he was talking about how it's no longer possible to be a CEO and avoid the culture war. So what do you make of that?
So first of all, putting all of this in context for our audience, I think the Senate is 50-50. The House of Representatives, the Democrats are up by 9. So we are talking about an environment where anything can happen. As you said in the beginning, always, historically, the party that is in the White House loses seats. They lose it for 2 reasons. Number one, it becomes a referendum on the president. And number two, because people want checks and balances. So they want that other party to check an over-aggressive presidential agenda. The only 2 times that didn't happen was during the Great Depression and after 9/11. So it is really kind of an historic built into politics. So when we started this year, we thought that was going to happen. Then a few things happened, the Dobbs decision. I think I would argue the way the Republicans handled the Dobbs decision. Let's pick a 10-year-old rape victim to exemplify where this could all go, right? I mean, so not that there's a good way to handle it, but badly mishandled. And then inflation coming down, President Biden, sort of running the table with legislative initiatives. But what is happening, and I'm glad you said that, so where does this go? Who knows? But there's a very good chance that the Republicans will control the Senate and the House. If they control the House, certainly they have told us, and there's a few things they're going to do. Number one, don't anticipate a lot of legislative action coming out of this because it's going to be close no matter what, right? And they're not going to want to hand Biden anything, that he can run on or the party can run on in 2024. There will be, they've already told us, it's just going to be a series of investigations, starting with Merrick Garland, the Hunter Biden laptop. I mean, that's just what we're going to see a lot of. And they have also said they're going after woke capitalism. Now, what is woke capitalism? It is when a company that's investing, or investment firms, go after ESGs. So they put money into, in particular, environmental goals. Now, this is where the Republicans, they've already called up BlackRock, and they have said they're going to call up every investor, major investment firm, who does this and doesn't back fossil fuels and other things for hearings. So you're going to see even more pressure, by way of saying, you're going to see even more pressure on CEOs. It is a very tough job. We see right now with Disney, in Florida with Ron DeSantis. I mean, who would ever think that Disney would be in the hairs of politics in Florida? It is going to be very challenging. Now, the last thing I'll just say is it's important they do what they need to do. The Edelman Trust Survey, which is a survey of everybody who says, who do you trust more? Well, nobody trusts the government. Most institutions are not trusted. The one place where there is a majority of trust is with their boss, their CEO. They trust them. When we start to look at the fact that we are now negotiating with people coming to work for us if we only give them, they only have to be in the office 3 days, right? I mean, the labor force still calls the shots. I think CEOs are going to have to get in this game, whether it's gay marriage, whether it's abortion, so many of these cultural issues that we're dealing with. But it's going to hurt. The last thing I do, well, two things I wanted to say. When I said it's a referendum on the president, what Trump coming back into this has done is made it a fistfight again, right? So it's no longer a referendum on Joe Biden. It's again Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, which most Republicans, they won't say it, but they're not happy that that is happening. And the last thing I will say, and I've answered like 6 different questions, and then I'll shut up. You are very right when you call it a populist movement. I've been a Republican all my life. The Republicans were the people like George Bush 41, who knew he was going to lose an election when he broke his promise to raise taxes because the Democrats said that they would cut spending and we would try to balance the budget. We were the pro-trade party. For a very long time, we were the pro-immigration party. And now we are a populist party. So I just want to say to everybody out there that those of us who are old-timers, this is not the Republican Party we signed up for, and they do not espouse Republican or conservative views in any way, shape, or form. You may agree with or disagree with them, but they are not hateful, they're not divisive, they're based on policies in which people believe, and that is no longer being represented by the majority of people in the Republican Party right now. Not voters, elected officials.
So Fred, picking up on something Susan said about woke capitalism, on the one hand, the Inflation Reduction Act was just passed. It's the most important climate change legislation, certainly in the United States and maybe in the world. On the other hand, there I think is going to be pressure, and you've identified energy as a sleeper issue where the politics can get murky, especially as we go into the back half of Biden's term. What do you see both politically and from a policy level happening in energy, and why is that such an important issue?
Well, first, thank you for having me here. Susan and I are in agreement on almost everything she said. But talking about energy, I think that the Inflation Reduction Act is the strongest and the largest investment this country has made, and probably any country has made, in renewable energy and a more sustainable, climate-friendly policy. It's not perfect, but it's the biggest step forward. I think the challenge we're going to have is everything has consequences, and frankly, Democrats don't like to acknowledge that, and neither do the Republican Party. And the fact is, whether are we going to buy oil from Venezuela?
Yeah.
Are we going to buy oil from Iran? If we're not going to buy it from Russia, are we going to put a pipeline in versus moving fuel and oil on rail cars? I mean, these are all trade-offs, and we're not our politics is not comfortable making any trade-offs right now. So we may need more, this is controversial, we may have to rely a little bit more on fossil fuel while we make the transition to a more sustainable economy, because transitions are always expensive. Think about moving. If you get a new apartment, so somehow for 2 months you're paying rent on 2 places because you haven't moved out of the old place, you're not in the new place. It's expensive. So when we make a transition from a more fossil fuel to more renewable energy, it's going to be expensive. And so we have to just recognize that. I think what's been lacking is there hasn't been, until the Inflation Reduction, a real sense that we really are genuinely moving in that direction. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it's a straight line, but I think up to now, it's been a lot of talk. Yes, people have talked about renewable energy, about wind power, about solar, but I think with the Inflation Reduction Act, we can see a real path forward, but it may not be a straight line.
We talked about the tensions in the Republican Party. There are tensions in the Democratic Party too, and Joe Manchin would probably heartily endorse what you just said. Bernie Sanders, not so much. Bernie Sanders also, could primary the president, right? I mean, so how do the Democrats deal with their intramural challenges too?
Well, I mean, one thing about Democrats, we may have some intra-party dilemmas, but we don't actually try and invade the Capitol. We don't actually try and shut down the government. We don't try and default on U.S. debt. And we actually believe in government and believe the government can do some good. So there is a big difference there. I think one of the things, this is an overly simplistic, but I think at some level the Republican Party or the Populist Party believes there is nothing government can do that will do any good.
Right.
And we have a lot of Democrats who believe that nothing that the private sector can do will come to any good. Those are both ridiculous and unworkable extremes. So hopefully we need to find enough. And the problem is what happens in the middle of the road? You get run over.
Yeah.
So the middle of the road is not a good place to be either. So finding a way that we can have some trade-offs is what's going to be necessary. The problem with trade-offs right now is if I agree to a compromise or a trade-off, instead of moving forward, I'm seen as having no spine, having no values, collaborating with the enemy, and that is not how democracies work.
Yeah. But let me ask this for the whole group. So I believe everything you just said, and yet this has been a really productive legislative session.
Exactly.
Right? Like a lot of things did happen, and there were a number of bipartisan bills, and there was the PACT Act, the Original Infrastructure Act, gun safety. Who would have thought that would pass? Under terrible circumstances, certainly, but nevertheless, CHIPS, even expanding NATO, and finally the IRA, which I think was a surprise to everyone. First of all, do you think McConnell was blindsided by that?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah?
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
The Democratic Party is not without blame. This year, for the first time, they funded over $25 million of election deniers in the Republican primary because they thought it would be easier to beat them. That, to me, is playing with fire. And I think every Democrat should say, this was not a good thing. I just had to say that because...
No, and I think, by doing that, you're actually mainstreaming hate. And one of our biggest concerns is that when Trump would go and do his rallies, hate crimes amongst marginalized communities would go up. And you could only imagine if that is now at a localized level, and there's so much relief that needs to happen to those localized communities, but no one is shedding light on that.
Do you think the policy successes or the legislative successes of the last term have a chance of taking down the temperature politically? Do you think that there's a way for that to have an impact?
I think, first of all, the majority of Americans don't know of the impact. I will share with you, we did some study and found that close to 30% of the people in the Latino community saw $600 of child tax credit in their bank account, but had no idea where it came from. Whose fault is that? But I do think that when you look at this idea...
Donald Trump would have had his
He
name
signed
on
it.
it.
Well, no, not that you brought it up. The number one reason Latinos voted for Trump is because of the checks he signed. They actually believe that that was not their money, but his money. And that just talks about people that are working hard and don't know how the government works. But you asked about this legislative process. What we don't give Biden enough credit for is being a public servant. He understands the institution of governing and how to do so. So he has been an incredible bipartisan president. And when we talk about the IRA, that is our modern day version of the New Deal. But we have yet to completely appreciate all that its repercussions it has, because it allows us to bring money back into people's homes in ways that people do not quite understand yet.
Yeah. So Jen, for CEOs and for folks, in business, which of these legislative accomplishments, is the most significant, both from a policy point of view, and then politically, what does this do sort of to the business lobby?
Sure. I want to also mention a key piece of legislation not on the list was the FAIR Act, which ended forced arbitration and which impacts millions of workers and ended sort of this chamber of secrets, if you will, where sexual harassment and discrimination cases were dealt with. A remarkable piece of legislation brought forward by Senators Gillibrand and Lindsey Graham, and voiced by Gretchen Carlson. So a very unusual circumstance of suspects coming together to transform labor law. Some say it's the biggest, change in 70 plus years. So I think that's really remarkable. Everything everyone said on the IRA, absolutely, and then some. I think it provides stability in the policy environment and the incentives that business need to see and hear to make the investments in this transformation. I do think I want to circle back to something Susan said that I think is notable too. 60% of voters will have on their ballot across the country this year an election denier from 2020. And I think that's really notable and really destabilizing, especially in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona. And these aren't issues necessarily that are front and center, right, for corporations or for their state public policy reps that are, full to the brim tracking a number of other issues. But goodness, these folks are going to be in positions of power and be able to put their thumb on the scale come the 2024 presidential cycle. And I think it's really important. As much as we try to engage companies to, sign petitions and say good things, we really need to see aspiration and words really turn into action at this time. And I know we haven't talked at all about corporate political giving, but I think that's a really important thread too, because as much as companies are having to sort of deal with this chaos and this unpredictable environment at the state and federal level, they're enabling it by supporting extremists at all levels.
Well, and they started after January 6th saying anybody who didn't validate, we're not going to contribute to. And I bet if we look, that's
right. And now they're doing cute things like supporting committees and doing things one step removed, so the dollars get even harder to trace.
Do CEOs want stable democracy? I mean, it's a simple, sort of dumb question, but it seems fundamental.
It is absolutely, it is the fundamental question. And I can't tell you how many times I speak with well-intentioned folks that say, right, will business save democracy? And I pause and I say, we have to make the externalities really tangible. For instance, I'll paint this picture. The US Postal Service is poised to become, and I don't know if folks saw this great article, I think it was an American Prospect, poised to become the largest provider of abortion in America. How do we get to that, right? Through the shipment of medication abortion. You can bet the lawsuits and the litigation, everything will come flying in the months and years ahead, right? So disruptions to commerce. We're going to see things like bans on interstate travel, things that, in the Roe era would have seemed just, isn't that unconstitutional? Why are we sort of going down this rabbit hole? So you're going to see the 2023 state legislative session is going to be no holds barred. You're going to see legislation introduced that is just going to leave you breathless. And companies are going to be dragged into this, whether they want to be or not.
I mean, you ask this whole question of, do companies want democracy? And I would say first ask any immigrant. Because what comes with autocracy is massive corruption. And that corruption is a business tax. You cannot thrive and make sure that you are the best version of yourself under those scenarios. And what has allowed us to thrive as a capitalist democracy is that that person, whether they swam the Rio Grande or they're an MIT immigrant trying to figure out the next genetic advancement, they both came here as entrepreneurs, thinking here is where they can make the best version of themselves. And that is an American idea that if we go backwards, not only we're going to stymie it for ourselves, but there's no other country that allows us to actually be free. Every single person, again, regardless of party, this is the frontier. Are we perfect? Absolutely not. Are we on an evolutionary track of being more just and equitable? Absolutely, if that is the intention. But if you look at where the corruption is coming from, whether you're looking at Venezuela or Russia, or that is what would happen if we do not have a fair marketplace.
Are you guys surprised that CEOs and companies haven't been more muscular in sort of pushing back on election denialism, in funding candidates who flirt with an election denial?
I think CEOs are frequently looking quarter to quarter. And, I was in Washington for 8 years under President Obama, and one of my criticisms which I voiced to the Chamber of Commerce is, if you only focus on taxes and regulatory reform, and then you go, oh, our time is up, we have no time for anything else, then that's what you get. But if the business community needs to actually widen its aperture and think about other things besides taxes and regulatory reform, there are other things that impact companies' bottom lines and just the environment that we're operating in. So I think the business community, frankly, needs to do a better job.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, but I'd also, again, I know I'm like the Republican flag holder here. That goes to the point, right? Republicans and Democrats, if you were going to make a broad generalization, Republicans want less government. Populists want more. And what you are seeing now in the discussions that we are having are elected officials and government party leaders telling businesses what culture they want.
That's right.
And that's where I draw the difference between Republicans and populists, because a true Republican would say, do what you need to do as long as you're not, hurting people or whatever. But this, under Trump and now the Republican Party, they are perpetuating more government in corporations and companies than probably ever before.
So a trend that's happening in parallel to populism in the Republican Party, or populism, in America and worldwide, and maybe it's driven by it. It's sort of hard to know where one ends and the other begins, right? Is all of the pressure on employers from all kinds of stakeholders, employees first and foremost, for sure, and we're seeing the resurgent labor movement as part of that, but also investors, activist investors, and other stakeholders, and customers for sure. And so I'm curious, like, how long does this tension last, and what, if anything, sort of breaks it between, government, particularly at the state level, putting a lot of burden on employers, CEOs and employers having a lot of expectations from their employees and customers and others, and the two being at cross purposes. How does this end?
Well, I'll say I think we have these two waves crashing, like you laid out. We have the rise of millennials and Gen Z in the workforce that come with a different set of expectations. They want to put their values to work, like was mentioned, that they really view the company beyond just a place where they get their paycheck, and they want to see those values put to work in their workplace. And at the same time, you're going to see increase in punitive state level legislation and other efforts that will reach in to the workplace. I mean, whether it's efforts to continue to repeal or rescind elements of the ACA. We just saw a federal judge out of Texas say it was okay for an employer to, with a religious point of view, to not cover PrEP, the HIV prevention medicine, despite the fact that Texas is in the top 3 of new HIV infections. We're going to see more and more sort of messing within the confines of the workforce, which is an inherently anti-Republican sentiment. So it's going to be these waves are going to crash.
So we're down to our last 5 minutes. So why don't we do some sort of quick, rapid fire answers? I'm curious for the whole group, if Republicans win the House, what should Biden do through executive order, in the first 100 days of the second half of his term, and what would be politically smart and what would be smart from a policy perspective?
That's a great question.
I'm happy to say paid family medical leave for federal contractors, especially large companies. That it was a piece notably left out of the IRA, had been on the chopping block again and again. A lot of good can be done with a stroke of a pen to ensure that at least companies that are federal contractors support accessible and inclusive paid family medical leave for their workers.
All right. It's like you won some votes here. So if Democrats hold the House, which would be a surprise, but could happen, obviously, is Nancy Pelosi Speaker? And if she's not Speaker, who is?
Hakeem Jeffries.
Yeah. And what does that mean then for the business community? What do you think?
Look, I'll let the Democrats answer, but he's a fairly reasonable, I think he's a good balance between the progressives and, the traditional Democrats, and he's very, he's a great communicator. I think he could actually unify the Democratic Party. When you talk about, look at me opining on the Democrats with the stage of Democrats, I'll just shut up. But also I think could be a powerful voice. Look, when we talk about what it's going to take to change, my initial answer is when Trump is not around anymore. But I also fear that the genie's been let out of the bottle, that there are all these people who were election deniers or, white nationalists or, pick an awful thing to be, who, QAnon, Proud Boys, I could take up the next three minutes, but they never had the validation.
Right.
Now, obviously through social media, they are getting to learn about each other and become more powerful. But when a president of the United States defends them and seems to support them, and then the rest of the party doesn't punish him for that. I'm so afraid that even without Trump, it's going to take a long time to get that genie back in the bottle. That was not the question, but
Yeah. Well, so let's say let's say he's out of the picture. DeSantis seems to be like a rising star. Did the Martha's Vineyard trip help or hurt him?
I think it hurt him. I mean, I think the fact that you have all this footage of people in Martha's Vineyard coming in, again. I think it hurt him, and I think it hurt him in a way that he didn't calculate, because the way people embraced those refugees, because they're refugees, and they're here legally because they have a right to seek asylum. That narrative has been missing, but it shows our American warmth. And you asked, what should Biden sign as executive order? Everything. And make it the court's problem. Because right now, there's roughly about 400 pieces of legislation that have not been passed from 2018 that the majority of Americans believe in. And the challenge is that he can't communicate it with the American people. He's done some of it. But one of the things that I think it could actually unify the country and deflate the MAGA movement is immigration reform. Because the moment you have a pathway for the 11 million Americans who have been living here for at least a minimum of 20 years, but do not have a social security number, that deflates the anger that they're trying to stir up. Because all of a sudden, we're all Americans once again.
Remaining votes. We're down to our last couple of minutes. Fred,
36 seconds.
Well, maybe we'll go into overage. So Fred, tell Putin, China, and the U.S. How does this play
in 29 seconds.
He's the most brilliant among us.
out? Be pithy.
First of all, in an era of Donald Trump, the idea of forecasting anything became simply absurd, number one. Number two, I think that the situation in Ukraine is very fraught in the following way. If the House becomes Republican, it will make funding for Ukraine exceedingly difficult.
Yeah, that's true.
It will make funding for anything difficult, but certainly Ukraine will be very difficult. COVID will be difficult. All that funding, I don't think it'll be all performative politics. Nothing substantial will come out of the House as a result of that. So I think that causes a great concern. I think that if Putin escalates in terms of chemical warfare or some other things, I think he runs the risk of really seeing a greater rift with China, with India, with the UAE. So in some way, that is a little bit of a stopgap. But I think we're living in a period that none of us imagined there'd be a land war with tanks rolling across Europe after World War II. That was in the quote unquote dustbin of history. So I think that this makes that, our politics and our global politics just far more complicated than they were, I would say, sort of from the fall of the Berlin Wall to about 2010, turned out to be, even with 9/11 and the financial crisis, a much more stable period than we're going to experience going forward.
Do you think Biden's going to spend the next 2 years of his term on foreign policy more? He's going to have to, or?
Well, it partly depends. I mean, if the Democrats retain the Senate, I think we're going to see a record number of judges confirmed. The Mitch McConnell strategy. We're going to get more judges have already been confirmed since JFK in 2 years. I think that's going to continue in the Senate. I think that's going to be the agenda.
Yep. And last word for you, Jen. So, knowing that your constituency are CEOs and businesses who are interested in progressive causes, what is your message to folks in the audience about what people can do?
Sure. Being anti-ESG, despite what the tempest in the teapot on some of the political tailwinds, being anti-ESG sort of isn't really a thing unless you want a poorly run company. So my message, regardless of the electoral outcome, is companies need to stay the course, align their aspirations, their words, and their actions. I think of the Simon and Garfunkel song, Mrs. Robinson, sort of a nation turns its lonely eyes to you. And again, we look to business to steady the ship, for better and for worse. That's the moment that we're in.
Great. Jen Stark, Susan Molinari, Maria, Teresa, Kumar, and Fred Hochberg. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.